Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a topic that, for many of us, evokes a deep, almost primal fear. The unseen, the insidious, the weaponized air we breathe. We're talking about chemical warfare.
It's a heavy one.
It really is. It's a subject that's both horrifying and, well, historically pivotal, forcing humanity to confront the darkest applications of its own ingenuity.
Absolutely. That intersection of science and destruction.
Yeah, exactly. Our mission today is to embark on a deep dive into the dark and complex evolution of chemical warfare. We're going to trace how these terrifying agents came into being,
Right.
how scientific advancement, often intended for good, was twisted into something truly devastating.
Yeah, the unintended consequences.
We'll explore why these weapons were used and sometimes, surprisingly, why they weren't used.
That's a fascinating part of the story, too, the restraint sometimes.
It is, and we'll unpack their enduring psychological impact right up to the modern day. We've pulled some incredible, albeit chilling, insights from our primary source, the Silent Scourge, a history of chemical warfare.
A really comprehensive look.
It is. This deep dive will uncover surprising facts and crucial insights into how chemistry, an arena of immense progress,
Yeah.
became intertwined with mass destruction.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our journey begins, perhaps counterintuitively, not on a blood-soaked battlefield.
Not where you might expect.
No, but in the heart of the Industrial Revolution, a period synonymous with scientific optimism and unprecedented human advancement.
A time of huge change.
Picture this, the mid-1800s. The world is being reshaped by steam power, new machinery, an explosion of scientific knowledge.
Right, everything's accelerating.
Chemistry, in particular, is experiencing a golden age, rapid and astonishing breakthroughs happening seemingly every day.
It really was. New discoveries constantly.
It's a period of incredible innovation, where the promise of science to improve human lives seems limitless.
Yeah.
New dyes, medicines, more efficient manufacturing.
All sorts of progress.
But what's truly fascinating, and frankly a little disturbing, is how this very progress, initially aimed at feeding and improving lives,
Yeah, the positive side.
inadvertently laid the foundational groundwork for some of the most horrific weapons humanity has ever conceived. It's a profound paradox, isn't it? How did something so inherently positive take such a dark, devastating turn?
Well, it's precisely that paradox, the dual-use nature of scientific discovery, that's so central here.
Dual use. Right.
Many of these early chemical advancements were absolutely not conceived with warfare in mind. Not at all. Consider, for example, the groundbreaking work of scientists like Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch in the early 20th century.
Okay, Haber-Bosch.
Their tireless research was focused on developing the Haber-Bosch process. Now, this was a method to synthesize ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen.
Ammonia from the air, essentially.
Exactly. And why was this revolutionary? Because ammonia is crucial for artificial fertilizers.
Ah, for agriculture.
Precisely. At the time, global food production was really struggling to keep pace with a rapidly growing population.
Right, Malthusian fears and all that.
Yeah, exactly. This process promised to vastly increase crop yields, potentially averting widespread famine, literally feeding the world. It was a massive boon for agriculture, a truly life-giving invention.
Incredible. A potential lifesaver.
But here's the grim irony. The very same fundamental chemical processes, the same deep understanding of molecular manipulation, the industrial-scale production techniques that allowed them to create these life-giving fertilizers, also became tragically crucial in manufacturing high explosives and, indeed, chemical weapons.
Wow. The exact same knowledge.
It's a stark example of how scientific knowledge, once it's out there, can be repurposed in ways its creators might never have intended.
Or wanted.
Or wanted, absolutely. Turning a tool for nourishment into an instrument of destruction. The knowledge itself is neutral, right? But its application depends entirely on human intent and circumstance.
That's an incredible point about intent versus outcome. And it's not as if the military wasn't thinking along these lines, maybe even before the industrial scale was fully there.
Well, yeah, the ideas start bubbling up.
Our source mentions that during the American Civil War, between 1861 and 1865, there were some truly nascent conceptual ideas about chemical attacks floating around.
Early thoughts, yeah.
We're talking about discussions, for example, of using chlorine gas in artillery shells, stuff like that.
Right, theoretical applications.
But these concepts, while they existed in theory, were never actually operationalized. They didn't see the light of day as actual weapons deployed on the battlefield.
Never really happened then.
So what held them back? Was it a lack of industrial capacity, perhaps effective delivery mechanisms, or was it simply that the perceived efficacy wasn't high enough to warrant the investment? Or maybe even, the ethical leap at the time?
That's an excellent, multifaceted question, and it really highlights the gap between thinking about something and actually doing it.
Right.
It was indeed a combination of factors, each acting as a significant barrier. Firstly, as you suggested, the industrial scale simply wasn't there yet. While chemistry was advancing, it hadn't reached the point where mass-producing these specific chemicals in quantities large enough to be militarily significant. Well, it wasn't feasible or even cost-effective.
Couldn't make enough of it matter.
Exactly. You couldn't just whip up tons of chlorine gas in a backyard shed,
Right.
Secondly, the delivery mechanisms were incredibly primitive. Ideas like putting gas into artillery shells were crude, really. They lacked the ability to effectively disperse the agent over a wide area or to maintain a concentrated cloud on a battlefield. You might get a localized puff, maybe.
But not a real tactical weapon.
Not a true weapon that could incapacitate an enemy line. And thirdly, the perceived efficacy was indeed a big part of it.
They weren't sure it would work.
Commanders at the time didn't have a clear understanding of how these gases would truly impact an enemy force in a large-scale battle. The tactical benefits weren't clear enough to outweigh the logistical hurdles.
And maybe the ick factor, too.
And perhaps, the ethical qualms of deploying something so unknown, potentially indiscriminate, and certainly terrifying. The sheer unpredictability made them less attractive than conventional weapons.
Oh.
What's fascinating here is how close these ideas were to horrifying reality, yet how far from practical implementation.
Just ideas on paper, almost.
Almost. But that was about to change drastically, as the next global conflict turned these nascent theories into horrifying, large-scale practice.
And what a drastic, brutal change it was. World War I stands as the grim crucible where chemical warfare truly began to define modern conflict.
Yeah, the turning point.
It was a horrifying yet undeniably pivotal moment in history where science and death married under the grim necessity of total war.
A terrible marriage.
Suddenly, those theoretical ideas about weaponized gases weren't just theoretical anymore. They became a terrifying, tangible reality for millions of soldiers caught in the static, nightmarish landscape of the trenches.
Unimaginable conditions.
And distinct types of gases, each with its own unique and horrific effects, emerged from this new, dark alchemy forever changing the face of warfare.
The start of something truly awful.
So which was the first big one?
Indeed. The first and perhaps most infamous gas to make its truly devastating debut was chlorine gas.
Chlorine.
It was first documented as being used by the German army at Ypres, Belgium in April 1915.
Ypres, a name synonymous with gas.
It is. Imagine this scene. The stagnant, muddy trenches, the constant sound of distant artillery, and then slowly, a greenish-yellow cloud begins to drift across no man's land.
Oh, God.
An unnatural fog that didn't just obscure vision, but actively sought to burn and destroy from within. Its immediate effect was terrifying. It aggressively burned the lungs, leading to agonizing asphyxiation.
Drowning on dry land.
Essentially, yes. A slow, terrifying drowning on dry land.
The casualties must have been immediate.
The human cost was immediate and stark. At Ypres alone, around 1,100 soldiers died from the initial exposure, and another 7,000 were injured.
Just from that one attack.
From that initial large-scale use. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Chlorine gas was quickly adopted and used extensively by all major powers involved in the war.
So everyone jumped on board.
Pretty much. Its introduction profoundly changed the nature of warfare. The element of surprise was paramount.
You wouldn't see it coming necessarily.
Exactly. Soldiers suddenly had to contend with an invisible enemy that moved with the wind, utterly unpredictable. The psychological shock of this new, unseen threat was immense.
I can't even imagine the fear.
It created a pervasive sense of vulnerability, a primal fear of the very air they breathed. It truly introduced a new dimension of fear in warfare.
And that led to gas masks, right?
Correctly. Leading directly to soldiers routinely carrying gas masks, a piece of equipment that became as essential and ubiquitous as their rifle.
Wow.
A constant chilling reminder of the unseen threat.
So the landscape of warfare literally changed overnight. Soldiers suddenly had to fight not just the enemy in front of them, but the very environment, which could turn toxic in an instant.
The battlefield itself became the weapon.
But the evolution of these weapons didn't stop there, did it? It seems like each new gas was designed to be even more insidious than the last.
Absolutely. The grim creativity continued, unfortunately. By late 1915, France introduced phosgene,
Phosgene, okay.
which was then quickly and widely adopted by Germany as well. Phosgene represented a significant escalation in lethality and, well, insidiousness.
Oh, so more deadly than chlorine.
While chlorine was horrific in its immediate visible effects, phosgene was often described as more lethal, precisely because of its delayed impact.
Delayed. What does that mean?
Its most terrifying characteristic was that it caused something called pulmonary edema. Essentially, the victim's lungs would slowly fill with fluid,
Oh, no.
often hours or even a full day after exposure.
So you wouldn't even know right away.
Exactly. Imagine the psychological horror. A soldier might initially feel relatively fine after an attack, maybe just a slight cough or irritation.
Thinking they got lucky.
Right. Only to collapse and die much later in the seeming safety of a dugout or a field hospital, their lungs slowly drowning them from the inside.
That's pure terror.
This delayed, agonizing horror was particularly devastating. It was responsible for an astonishing 85% of the estimated 90,000 chemical weapon deaths in World War I.
85% from phosgene.
Primarily from phosgene and related agents, yes. The fear of phosgene was a uniquely insidious one. It wasn't just the terror of the attack, but the gnawing anxiety of not knowing if you were already a dead man walking.
God.
It cemented the idea that chemical weapons were a fundamentally different kind of terror, not just about immediate combat, but about a prolonged, agonizing demise.
And it didn't stop there either, did it? There was another major one.
And then in 1917, Germany introduced what many consider the most iconic and psychologically impactful gas of the war. Mustard gas, or sulfur mustard.
Mustard gas, everyone's heard of that one.
It's infamous. Unlike chlorine or phosgene, mustard gas wasn't always immediately deadly. Its primary aim was, in a grim way, strategic, to incapacitate and disfigure.
To wound, not necessarily kill.
To create massive numbers of casualties who required long-term care, thereby draining enemy resources and morale. It caused severe blistering on exposed skin, in the eyes, and in the respiratory tract. Horrific internal burns.
Blistering, like chemical burns.
Exactly. The sheer pain and disfigurement were almost unimaginable.
And what made it so different, besides the blistering?
But what truly set it apart, making it a persistent nightmare, was its longevity on the battlefield.
It stuck around.
Yes. This wasn't a fleeting cloud that dissipated after a few minutes. Mustard gas could linger on the battlefield for days, even weeks, contaminating trenches, equipment, the very ground itself.
Creating no-go zones.
Creating a sustained area of danger, exactly. Soldiers couldn't just advance into a gassed area. They had to wait for it to clear or take immense risks.
The psychological impact must have been immense.
The psychological terror it inflicted was profound. It blinded and disfigured countless soldiers, turning able-bodied men into agonizing, often permanent casualties.
Just horrific.
This weapon, more than any other, cemented WWI's grim moniker as the Chemist's War.
The Chemist's War, yeah.
Highlighting how central and devastating chemical innovation became to the conflict, transforming it into a battlefield where the very air was a weapon.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and you can truly grasp the scale of the horror. The sheer devastation and psychological trauma unleashed by these gases in WWI led to a global outcry.
Understandably.
There was a near universal sense that this was a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed, and that it should not be crossed again. You'd think, wouldn't you, that such a horrific experience would mean the complete end of chemical weapons forever?
That would be the logical, humane reaction.
That the world would collectively say never again. But did it?
Not quite.
Not quite. And the reasons why are as cynical as they are revealing.
The politics got in the way.
So we move into the interwar period, from 1919 to 1939, a time that seemed to hold a glimmer of hope for a more humane approach to warfare, right?
There was definitely a desire to prevent a repeat.
This period saw the creation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, an international agreement that, on the surface, looked like a significant step forward, banning the use of chemical weapons in warfare.
A landmark agreement, seemingly.
But right away, our source highlights a critical, almost self-defeating loophole.
Ah, the loophole.
It explicitly banned use, but explicitly not development or stockpiling.
Crucial distinction.
This isn't just a nuance, it's a gaping chasm in the treaty. And this begs the question, what were the true implications of this loophole? How did it shape the landscape between the wars?
That loophole, while maybe seeming minor or just a diplomatic compromise at the time, was absolutely critical and had profound, chilling implications.
There wasn't an accident then.
No, it wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate, strategic rationale born out of deep mistrust between nations.
Ah, okay.
Powers that had just endured the Great War, while outwardly professing peace, were still deeply suspicious of each other. They feared disarming themselves of a potential weapon, while their adversaries might secretly continue research.
And the classic security dilemma.
Exactly. It was a classic, I won't use it if you don't, but I need to have it just in case you do mentality.
So everyone kept working on them quietly.
This created a quiet, insidious arms race, hidden in laboratories and secure facilities. Major powers like the USSR, Japan, Britain, Germany, the US, they all continued their chemical weapons research, building up their stockpiles.
Just in case.
Just in case. They invested heavily in new agents, more efficient production methods, better delivery systems, never quite trusting that others would truly abide by the spirit of the protocol.
So it was an unspoken arms race.
An unspoken, terrifying understanding that if deterrence failed or if circumstances became desperate enough, these weapons might still be brought out. The irony is that by allowing stockpiling as a form of deterrence, it simultaneously ensured the continued development and readiness of these weapons.
And we saw the stark consequences of this loophole, not just in quiet stockpiling, but in actual horrific use during this period. It wasn't just a theoretical threat, was it?
Precisely. A particularly chilling example is Japan's actions during the Second Sino-Japanese War, which raged from 1937 to 1945.
Right, before WWII really kicked off globally.
Exactly. Despite being a signatory to the Geneva Protocol, Japan made extensive and brutal use of chemical agents, specifically mustard gas and lewisite.
Lewisite, what's that?
Another highly toxic blister agent, similar in effect to mustard gas, but perhaps acting faster. They used these against both Chinese troops and, devastatingly, Chinese civilians.
Against civilians,
Yeah.
Tis.
Our source notes that the exact casualty figures from these attacks remain largely unknown. The chaos of war, the nature of the weapons.
Hard to count.
Very hard. But reports confirm widespread and horrific suffering, with thousands succumbing to chemical burns, respiratory failure, enduring agonizing deaths or lifelong disabilities.
That's brutal.
It was a truly horrifying campaign, often conducted in secret, away from international scrutiny.
And what did the world do? The League of Nations.
This incident tells us a great deal about the early challenges of global enforcement. China, in desperation, appealed to the League of Nations for intervention.
Yeah.
But the action taken by the international body was feeble, largely ineffective. Primarily due to political complexities, the reluctance of major powers to directly confront Japan at that time.
So ineffective.
It reveals a fundamental weakness of international law without robust enforcement mechanisms and the genuine political will of powerful nations to uphold them.
Words on paper aren't enough.
Exactly. Without true collective action and the teeth to genuinely hold powerful nations accountable, even well-intentioned treaties can become mere parchment barriers against the brutal realities of warfare. A bitter lesson learned time and again.
So the world learned a harsh lesson about loopholes and the limits of protocols, didn't it? The hopeful promise was deeply undermined.
It really was.
Yet as World War II dawned, a truly surprising thing happened. Chemical weapons, despite the fearsome advancements in massive stockpiles, saw very limited use.
Which is kind of amazing given the scale of that war.
It's a massive paradox, given the unprecedented scale and brutality of the conflict. Why, after WWI's terror and the silent interwar arms race, were these weapons largely absent from WWII battlefields? It seems counterintuitive.
That's truly the central paradox of World War II, and it's a fascinating study in deterrence.
Deterrence, okay.
Despite the widespread fears and the immense stockpiles accumulated by all sides, chemical weapons were, for the most part, held in reserve. The primary reason, as the Silent Scourge points out, was the pervasive and mutually understood fear of retaliation.
Everyone had them, so nobody used them.
Essentially, yes. It was a grim stalemate based on the concept of mutual assured destruction, or at least mutual devastation by chemical means. If one side used them, the other side would inevitably respond in kind.
Escalation nobody wanted.
Leading to an uncontrollable escalation that no one truly wanted. The psychological terror of WWI was still fresh in the minds of military leaders.
They remembered Ypres.
They remembered. And the potential for an even worse chemical nightmare in an already devastating global conflict was a powerful deterrent.
Especially considering what Germany had developed, right? Something new.
And this hesitation is particularly striking when you consider Germany's groundbreaking advancements during this period. While the Allies focused on refining WWI-era agents like mustard gas,
Yeah.
Germany, under the brilliant but, let's say, ethically compromised chemist Gerhard Schrader, had developed the world's first true nerve agents.
Nerve agents. Okay, that sounds even worse.
These were a game changer, fundamentally different from the blister or choking agents of WWI. We're talking about taboon, invented in 1936.
Taboon.
Sarin, invented in 1938, a name you might recognize from later terrorist attacks.
Sarin, yeah, definitely heard of that.
And so sarin, developed in 1944.
Hold on, so these weren't just stronger versions of WWI gases. How are they fundamentally different in their mechanism? What made them so much more terrifying?
That's a crucial distinction. Unlike the WWI gases that primarily cause physical burns or lung damage, nerve agents attack the body's most vital control system, the nervous system.
How do they do that?
They work by disrupting the communication between nerves and muscles. Specifically, they inhibit an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase.
Okay, acetylcholinesterase.
Right. This enzyme normally breaks down a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. When the enzyme is inhibited, acetylcholine builds up, leading to an overstimulation of muscles and glands.
So the body goes haywire.
Completely. This causes horrific, uncontrollable effects. Initial symptoms might include constricted pupils, convulsions, excessive salivation, vomiting, rapidly progressing to paralysis of the respiratory muscles.
Can't breathe.
Ultimately, death by asphyxiation as the body loses control of its vital functions. They were significantly more advanced and deadly than anything seen before. A silent, invisible killer that hijacked the body's own processes.
So, if Germany possessed these incredibly powerful, devastating weapons, far more potent than WWI gases, why the hesitation? Why didn't Hitler unleash them, especially as the war turned against him?
Well, the reported reasons for Hitler's hesitation are quite telling, actually. Yeah. Firstly, as we mentioned, he greatly feared Allied retaliation. He knew the Allies also had chemical stockpiles, particularly mustard gas, and he understood the potential for a catastrophic chemical free-for-all across Europe.
Didn't want it used on Germany.
Exactly, which could utterly cripple his war machine and civilian population. But there's also a deeply personal dimension, a piece of historical speculation that many historians find compelling.
What's that?
Hitler himself had been a victim of gas exposure during WWI. He suffered temporary blindness from a mustard gas attack at Ypres in 1918.
Ah, he experienced it himself.
Some argue that this personal, horrific experience instilled in him a visceral revulsion, or at least a deep respect for the sheer terror and unpredictability of these weapons.
So maybe that made him hold back.
Leading to his unique restraint in their use, perhaps, even when faced with imminent defeat. It's a chilling thought. How might history have changed if these nerve agents had been widely deployed? The scale of human suffering, unimaginable.
Unimaginable. But the Allies were ready, just in case.
Oh, absolutely. It's important to note that the Allies weren't just passively hoping Germany wouldn't use them. They were very much prepared.
Stockpiles, ready to go.
They also stockpiled vast quantities of mustard gas and other agents, ready to respond in kind if Hitler broke the unspoken taboo. And this preparedness, ironically, led to one of the war's most tragic and relatively little-known accidents, which highlights the inherent danger of these weapons even when not actively deployed in combat.
What happened?
In December 1943, in the port of Bari, Italy, a German air raid struck an Allied ship, the SS John Harvey. This ship was secretly carrying a cargo of 2,000 M47 mustard gas bombs, part of the Allied retaliatory stockpile.
Oh no, so bombs were hit.
The explosion and subsequent release of the gas into the harbor led to an immediate, horrific consequence. Over 1,000 Allied military personnel and local civilians died due to exposure.
1,000 people. From an accident.
Yes, and many more suffered agonizing long-term effects. Most of the victims had no idea they were dealing with chemical agents.
Why not?
Because the cover-up was swift and total. This wasn't a battlefield deployment, but it serves as a grim, potent example of the inherent danger.
Even just transporting them.
Even when they're simply being transported or stored. And what's particularly chilling about the Bari incident is that it was covered up by Allied governments for decades.
Covered up.
Official reports attributed the deaths to conventional bombs, highlighting the intense secrecy and sensitivity surrounding these weapons programs.
Wow.
And the lengths governments would go to control the narrative, even at the cost of failing to properly treat the victims.
This raises an important question. If World War II saw such a surprising degree of restraint, this unspoken agreement, what happened as the Cold War ratcheted up?
The Cold War.
It seems the very concept of deterrence, while preventing outright use between superpowers, only pushed the science further, creating even more unimaginable weapons in a chilling underground arms race.
You're absolutely right. The Cold War marked a period where chemical and indeed biological weapons moved from being battlefield curiosities to becoming terrifying pawns in the larger strategic game of mutually assured destruction.
MAD, but with chemicals too.
Exactly. The restraint of WWII didn't eliminate the pursuit. It simply pushed development into deeper secrecy and towards even deadlier forms, acting as a grim, ever-present deterrent.
Keeping the peace through terror, basically.
The idea was that the horror of these weapons would keep them from being used, but that horror had to be continually upgraded.
So what came next? Even worse than sarin.
This era saw the birth of agents that truly sound like something out of a spy novel, designed for maximum lethality and stealth. Take the VX nerve agent.
Big guy.
Developed in the 1950s by the UK and USA. This wasn't just deadlier than sarin, it had a terrifying new characteristic. It's a persistent agent.
Persistent. Like mustard gas.
Meaning it evaporates very slowly, can remain a hazard for extended periods, and crucially, it can be absorbed through the skin.
Through the skin. Wow.
Meaning even a tiny invisible drop on your clothes or skin could be lethal. Its effects were horrific. Uncontrollable muscle spasms, complete paralysis, death by suffocation.
This is awful.
NATO stockpiled thousands of tons of this agent. A silent, unseen threat capable of widespread devastation.
But it was never used in a major war.
But crucially and thankfully, VX was never used in open warfare between major powers. This again underscores the chilling role of deterrence, the never-cross-this-line mentality.
They were too scared of the consequences.
That prevented these incredibly potent agents from being unleashed by the major powers, even as both sides accumulated arsenals capable of wiping out entire populations.
And the Soviets had their own versions.
And the escalation continued in even deeper secrecy. The Soviet Union, in a highly secretive program between the 1970s and 1990s, developed a new class of agents known as Novichok.
Novichok. That's been in the news more recently.
It has, unfortunately. These were particularly insidious because they were binary nerve agents.
Binary. What does that mean?
Meaning their chemical components were stored separately and only combined on-site just before use, often during the actual delivery mechanism.
Making them safer to handle, maybe,
No.
but harder to track?
Exactly, making them incredibly potent once combined, but much harder to detect or reverse engineer by intelligence agencies. Their unique composition also meant they bypassed many existing international detection protocols for traditional nerve agents.
Sneaky.
When combined, they became some of the most potent poisons ever created, estimated to be 5 to 10 times more lethal than even VX.
5 to 10 times VX. That's terrifying.
Some of the most potent poisons ever created. The world only learned about these terrifying developments in the 1990s when a brave defector named Vilmir Zyanov,
The whistleblower.
a Soviet scientist involved in the program, brought them to public light, confirming the fears of many Western intelligence agencies.
So even with the superpowers holding back due to the terror of mutual annihilation, these weapons didn't stay entirely contained.
No, unfortunately not.
It seems the grim reality of battlefield use, once unleashed in WWI, found its way back into other conflicts, horrifyingly reminding the world of their potential, particularly when ethical boundaries crumbled.
That's a crucial point. While major powers held their chemical weapons in check due to the threat of retaliation, the grim reality of battlefield use returned in other conflicts where such deterrence was less effective or non-existent.
Like where?
The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 is a stark and deeply disturbing example. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, flagrantly used both WWI-era mustard gas and the more advanced Taboon nerve agent against Iranian forces.
Against Iran, so state-on-state use returned.
Yes. This was a sustained campaign affecting hundreds of thousands of soldiers, leading to immense suffering and long-term health consequences.
But it got even worse, didn't it?
But the absolute nadir of this period, and perhaps one of the darkest moments in modern chemical warfare, was the Halabja massacre in 1988.
Halabja. I remember hearing about that. Horrific.
This was an unspeakable act where Iraq unleashed a devastating cocktail of sarin, taboon, VX, and mustard gas on its own Kurdish civilian population in the town of Halabja.
Against his own people.
Yeah.
with everything he had.
Yes. The figures are heartbreaking and difficult to comprehend. An estimated 5,000 people were killed almost immediately.
5,000 civilians.
And then over 10,000 more were injured, many suffering lifelong disabilities, chronic illnesses, profound psychological trauma. The images, they're seared into the collective memory.
That's truly horrific. What does an incident like Halabja reveal about the moral boundaries of warfare, or rather the complete collapse of them?
Halabja stands as one of the worst chemical attacks on civilians in history, a horrific demonstration of the absolute disregard for human life and international norms when these weapons are deployed without restraint.
No rules applied.
It highlighted the complete breakdown of any moral or ethical barrier in that conflict, showing how these weapons could be turned on one's own people as instruments of terror and political oppression.
And the world's response?
The world's response was, tragically, slow and inadequate, underscoring the challenges of intervention even in the face of such clear atrocities.
And we've seen it again more recently, haven't we? Syria.
And even more recently, yes, in the 2010s, we've seen the horrifying return of chemical attacks in Syria's civil war, despite international treaties aiming to prevent such atrocities.
Ghouta.
The Ghouta attack in 2013, where sarin gas was used, killed over 1,000 civilians in a single night.
1,000 people.
Beyond that, watchdog groups have reported numerous chlorine barrel bomb attacks, a cruder but still terrifying method dropped from helicopters on civilian areas.
Barrel bombs. Just awful.
While these attacks drew global condemnation and even led to international efforts to dismantle Syria's declared chemical weapons stockpile,
They tried to get rid of them.
direct, decisive international intervention to stop their ongoing use was limited. Again, raising fundamental questions about the effectiveness of global oversight and enforcement when geopolitical will is lacking.
Still happening.
It's a stark reminder that the threat and the reality of chemical weapon use is far from eradicated.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you see a chilling trend. From state-on-state warfare, often driven by Cold War deterrence, the threat began to morph, finding new, terrifying avenues for deployment even by non-state actors. It's a truly disturbing shift from traditional battlefields to potentially anywhere.
That shift is indeed incredibly disturbing.
We've seen how chemical weapons evolved from crude battlefield tools to sophisticated instruments of state terror, even when held in check. But now we have to shift our focus to a different, equally disturbing use: terrorism.
The non-state actor threat.
It's one thing when militaries employ them, however horrific. But how did these weapons, previously largely confined to state arsenals, move into the hands of non-state actors, causing devastation in civilian spaces? This was a game changer, wasn't it?
This was the truly alarming new chapter, yes. One that brought the threat literally to our doorsteps and reshaped global security priorities.
The prime example being Tokyo.
The most infamous example and a critical wake-up call is the Akiwum Shinrikyo cult's sarin attack in the Tokyo subway in 1995.
A cult using sarin gas.
How? This wasn't a military operation, it was domestic cult-driven terrorism. The cult, led by Shoko Asahara, had actually managed to synthesize sarin with alarming proficiency.
They made it themselves.
Yes, reflecting a disturbing level of technical capability for a non-state group. They released the gas during rush hour on multiple subway lines.
During rush hour, maximum casualty.
Killing 13 people and injuring over 1,000, many suffering permanent neurological damage.
Horrifying.
This incident was a critical, horrifying wake-up call for global security. It definitively proved that non-state actors, even a rogue cult, could access, produce, and effectively deploy weapons of mass destruction,
Bypassing state controls.
circumventing traditional state controls and military protocols. The psychological impact was immense, not just in Japan, but globally.
Changed everything for security agencies.
Forcing governments and security agencies worldwide to fundamentally rethink their strategies for defending against such asymmetrical threats. Increased focus on counterterrorism, non-proliferation of WMDs, it shattered the illusion that these weapons were solely the domain of nation-states.
And there was another incident involving state use, but in a counterterrorism context: Moscow.
Another deeply troubling incident occurred in 2002 involving the Russian FSB and the Moscow theater hostage crisis.
Right, the theater scene.
In an attempt to end the standoff with Chechen hostage-takers who had seized a theater filled with civilians, the Russian special forces used a fentanyl-based chemical agent.
Fentanyl, like the opioid, weaponized.
A potent derivative, yes. The intention was to incapacitate the terrorists, allowing for their capture or neutralization.
To knock them out, basically.
However, the tragic outcome was devastating. While it did kill all the Chechen hostage takers, it also, horrifyingly, resulted in the deaths of over 130 hostages.
130 hostages died from the gas.
Most of these civilian deaths were attributed directly to the chemical agent used, which caused respiratory failure and unconsciousness.
That's a truly complex and tragic situation.
Yeah.
It highlights the inherent dangers of using such agents, even when the intention is to save lives, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. This incident highlights the inherent dangers and devastating unintended consequences of using such agents, even in what was considered a tactical, controlled scenario by a state actor.
It's hard to control these things.
It underscores the immense difficulty of deploying these weapons safely or precisely, even by well-trained forces. When innocent lives are at stake in a confined space, the collateral damage can be immense.
Even trying to do good can go wrong.
Proving that even when a government is trying to save lives, these agents carry an uncontrollable risk, leading to immense tragedy. It also opened up a whole new debate about the less lethal application of chemical agents and how even those can be fatal.
So what does this all mean for the world today? We've traced this horrific arc. Industrial accidents, WWI, interwar loopholes, WWII restraint, Cold War escalation, regional conflicts, terrorism.
It's been quite a journey.
While treaties aim to control, it's clear the lingering threats are complex and persistent, aren't they?
Absolutely. The international community did respond to these continued horrors, particularly after Iran, Iraq, and Tokyo. The Chemical Weapons Convention, or CWC, signed in 1993.
The CWC, right?
Represents the most significant and ambitious global effort to control and eliminate these weapons entirely. Its core tenets are incredibly far-reaching.
More than just banning use.
Much more. It banned the production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons, going far beyond the 1925 Geneva Protocol. It established the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW,
Inspectors.
to oversee its implementation, conduct inspections, verify destruction.
And has it worked? Have countries signed on?
The CWC has achieved truly global reach. Over 190 countries signed on, committing to its principles. And remarkably, it has overseen extensive destruction programs.
So stockpiles were destroyed.
Nations that joined, including the US and Russia, declared their vast stockpiles and began systematic destruction. By 2023, 100% of declared chemical weapons stockpiles under the CWC were reportedly destroyed.
100% declared destroyed. That's huge.
This is a monumental achievement, a testament to international cooperation and political will, arguably one of the most successful disarmament treaties in history.
That's genuinely hopeful. It shows it can be done.
It demonstrated that the world can come together to eliminate an entire class of horrific weapons.
But, and it's a big but, despite these successes, lingering threats persist, don't they? The key word there was declared.
Unfortunately, yes. Despite the CWC's monumental achievements, the threat is far from eradicated. We're not in a world entirely free of this danger, and the challenges are multifaceted.
Like what? What are the main worries now?
We still face the risk from rogue actors or non-state groups operating outside international norms, like Aum Shinrikyo showed us.
Terror groups getting hold of it.
There's also the concern of hidden caches that may not have been declared or discovered during the initial CWC verification processes.
Secret stashes.
And then there's the ever-present issue of dual-use technologies.
Back to that again.
These are substances or scientific knowledge used in seemingly benign applications. Pesticides, pharmaceuticals, industrial processes that can, with the right knowledge and malicious intent, be quickly weaponized.
And making fertilizer one day, weapons the next.
The line between civilian and military chemistry can be incredibly thin, making control a perpetual challenge.
And are there specific countries that are still a concern?
And unfortunately, specific areas of concern remain. Russia, despite having declared and supposedly destroyed its weapons under the CWC, has faced accusations of using Novichok agents in assassination attempts.
Raising serious questions.
Serious questions about undeclared programs, yes. Syria has repeatedly used chemical weapons during its civil war, as we discussed, despite joining the CWC.
Still using them.
And North Korea is widely believed to possess a significant chemical weapons program operating entirely outside the convention's framework. So while the progress has been undeniable, eternal vigilance remains the price of safety.
It's an ongoing battle.
If we look back across this entire historical journey, from the rudimentary, wind-dependent gas clouds of Ypres to the invisible poisons that disrupt nerves at the molecular level, it's a truly chilling evolution.
From clouds to molecules.
The trauma inflicted by chemical weapons remains etched into military history and collective memory, a dark stain. It's a crucial takeaway for you, the listener, that chemical weapons were not always the most efficient in terms of pure military objectives.
Really, not efficient.
They often caused logistical nightmares, were dependent on unpredictable wind conditions, could even blow back on the attackers. Conventional artillery or bombs often caused more immediate, measurable damage.
So why use them then?
Their true power, their enduring legacy, was unmatched in the psychological terror they wielded.
The fear factor.
They created a fear that transcended physical injury. Fear of the invisible, the uncontrollable, the insidious, turning the very air into a weapon. They sowed panic and demoralization far beyond their immediate physical casualties.
Pure psychological warfare.
And in every case, from their accidental industrial beginnings to their deliberate use in conflict, their development was not born out of some inherent scientific evil.
Science itself isn't evil.
But rather political desperation, strategic calculation, and, tragically, a profound human indifference to suffering.
That's a heavy thought. Indifference to suffering.
It's a reminder of the choices societies make when pushed to the brink and the devastating consequences that can unfold when scientific progress outpaces ethical consideration.
And what an intense, often terrifying journey it has been. We've moved from unsuspecting industrial breakthroughs through the crucible of WWI, where science and death truly married, into the deceptive calm of the interwar period, the shocking restraint of WWII, the Cold War escalation to terrifying heights.
The Hork.
Only to have them return with devastating force in regional conflicts and, chillingly, in acts of terrorism. And finally, wrestling with modern control efforts and the persistent threats that still linger.
A complex history indeed.
For you, the listener, what does this deep dive into the alchemy of fear mean for how we perceive the intersection of scientific advancement, political pressure, and that chilling reality of human indifference? What stands out to you as the most surprising or disturbing lesson from this history? Is it the dual-use nature of discovery, the power of deterrence, or the persistent willingness of some to cross the darkest moral lines?
Lots to think about there.
It's a history that forces us to confront not just the weapons themselves, but the human motivations and societal failures behind their creation and use, and to ponder the eternal question: how do we ensure that knowledge is always used for good?